She had cooked for that saloon every single day for 3 years. 3 years of 4 a.m. mornings, cracked hands, and meals that made grown men go quiet mid-sentence. And the night the snowstorm hit, the night the whole town huddled inside the Red Coyote just to stay alive, the owner, Gerald Hatch, slammed his fist on the counter and pointed at Eleanor Briggs in front of every person in that room. "You're lucky I even keep you on," he said, loud enough for the whole saloon to hear. "Who else would hire something that looks like you?" Nobody said a word. Nobody moved. Eleanor stood there holding a cast iron pan still hot from the stove, and she didn't cry, she didn't run, she just turned back to the fire and kept cooking. Because that's what invisible women do. They survive. But everything was about to change. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have protected you, stay with me. This one's for you. If this story moves you, please subscribe and hit that like button, and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far Eleanor's story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The Red Coyote Saloon sat at the edge of Bitter Creek, like something the prairie had coughed up and forgotten about. It was a 2-story building with warped siding and a sign that had lost its second O sometime back in the spring, so by October it just read, Red Sea Yacht, which most people figured was close enough. The floors were permanently sticky. The windows were never fully clean, and somewhere beneath the smell of tobacco and spilled whiskey, if you paid attention, if you were the kind of person who actually paid attention, you could catch something else entirely, something warm, something that had no business being in a place like that. That smell was Eleanor Briggs, and it came from her kitchen. She arrived before sunrise every morning, not because anyone required it, not because Gerald Hatch told her to. She arrived because the bread needed time to rise properly, and Eleanor Briggs was not the kind of woman who served bread that hadn't risen properly. That was the one thing in her life she controlled completely, and she controlled it like her life depended on it, which, in a way, it did. She was 34 years old, though most people guessed older. Frontier living had a way of borrowing years from a woman's face without asking. Her hair was always pulled back tight, dark brown with threads of early gray that she'd stopped fighting sometime in her 20s. She was broad-shouldered, heavy-set, the kind of woman whose presence filled a room even when she was trying not to be noticed, which was always, because being noticed in the Red Coyote rarely led to anything good. The miners noticed her when they wanted more coffee. The cowboys noticed her when the food was slow. Gerald Hatch noticed her when he wanted someone to blame. Outside of that, Eleanor Briggs was, for all practical purposes, invisible. She had come to Bitter Creek 3 years earlier following a husband who turned out to be 3 parts charm and 1 part pure cowardice. He'd left her somewhere outside of Yankton with $11, a carpet bag, and a note that said, "I'm sorry, Ellie, I just wasn't built for this." She'd read it twice, folded it carefully, and used it to start her cook fire the next morning. She never mentioned his name again. Not to anyone, not even to herself. Gerald Hatch had hired her that same week. He wasn't being generous. Generosity wasn't something Gerald Hatch kept in stock. He hired her because his previous cook had gone back east with a broken arm and a broken spirit. And Eleanor had shown up at exactly the right moment, carrying a skillet and asking if there was work. Gerald had looked her up and down in a way that made her feel like a piece of livestock being appraised at auction, then offered her 32 cents a day plus room and board. She took it. The room was a converted storage closet off the kitchen with a cot, a small window, and a hook on the wall for her coat. The board was whatever she cooked for herself after the paying customers were fed. It wasn't much. But it was a roof, and that winter, a roof was a fortune. By Christmas, the miners were telling each other to make sure they got to the Red Coyote on Fridays, because that was when Eleanor made her stew. By February, cowboys were riding an extra 4 miles past 2 other saloons to eat her pan-fried venison. By spring, Gerald Hatch had quietly raised his dinner prices by 15 cents, and never once mentioned Eleanor's name in connection with why his business had improved. He wasn't the type. "You burned the beans again," he told her one Tuesday in March, standing in the kitchen doorway with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders. The beans were not burned. They were, in fact, perfectly seasoned pinto beans that had been simmering for 6 hours. Eleanor knew this because she had checked them 4 times. "They're not burned, Mr. Hatch," she said without turning around. "I'm saying they smell off." "They don't smell off." Eleanor. His voice dropped the way it always did when he was about to say something he wanted to land hard. You want to keep arguing with me, or you want to keep this job? She didn't answer. She picked up her stirring spoon and went back to the pot. That was how most of their conversations ended. Not with resolution, not with dignity, just with Eleanor turning back to whatever she was cooking and Gerald walking away with the satisfied look of a man who believed silence was the same as winning. The other women in Bitter Creek didn't have much to say to Eleanor. There were only 7 of them within riding distance, and 5 were married to men with opinions about which women were appropriate to associate with. Eleanor didn't go to church. Eleanor wasn't married. Eleanor lived and worked inside a saloon, which in 1888 carried its own set of assumptions that she'd given up trying to correct. The 2 women who weren't particular about such things, Marta, who ran the dry goods store, and a Lakota woman named Winona, who lived with her nephew on the eastern edge of town. Those 2 were decent to Eleanor. Marta sometimes saved back the good flour without being asked. Winona once brought her a jar of choke cherry preserves in the fall and sat with her for an hour without saying much, which Eleanor found more comforting than most conversations she'd had in years. But friendship, real friendship, was a luxury Eleanor didn't quite know how to hold anymore. She'd been alone long enough that solitude had started feeling like a personality trait. She cooked, she cleaned, she slept. She woke up before dawn and started over. That was her life. That was all she expected it to be. The snowstorm hit Bitter Creek on the 14th of December like something personally angry at the town. It came in from the northwest in the late afternoon, which gave people just enough warning to make bad decisions. Half the miners who'd planned to ride back to their camp stayed. The 2 cowboys who'd been planning to leave ended up at the bar instead. A traveling salesman named Peterson got his wagon stuck in the ditch outside of town and came stumbling into the Red Coyote with ice in his mustache, demanding hot food and demanding it now, as if Eleanor had somehow personally conspired with the weather to inconvenience him. By 7 o'clock that evening, the saloon was packed with 32 men and the particular restless energy of people who were stuck somewhere they hadn't planned to be. Gerald Hatch was in his element. Full house, steady drinking, coins moving fast. Eleanor was in her kitchen alone, cooking for 32 on a stove built for 12, and doing it without complaint because complaint had never once changed anything. She had a pot of elk chili going, thick and dark, the kind that required 2 full days of preparation if you did it right. She'd started it 2 days ago because she'd watched the clouds coming and made her calculation. She had cornbread in the oven, 4 cast iron skillets worth, golden at the edges, with a touch of honey she'd been rationing carefully since September. She had a side of preserved green beans with salt pork, and a dried apple cobbler that had been her own addition, unauthorized, using the last of the apples she'd traded Marta for in October. It was, by any honest measure, a remarkable meal for a blizzard night in a one-horse frontier town. Not that anyone was going to say that. The chili went out in bowls. The cornbread went out in chunks wrapped in cloth to keep warm. Eleanor carried it herself because the boy Gerald hired to bus tables had gotten frightened by the storm and hidden somewhere upstairs. She moved through the crowded room with the particular efficiency of a woman who had learned to take up as little space as possible, setting down bowls without making eye contact, refilling cups without being asked, disappearing back into the kitchen before anyone thought to acknowledge she'd been there. "More cornbread," someone called out from a table near the window. She brought it. "This chili's cold," another man said, pushing his bowl toward the edge of the table. It wasn't cold. She'd carried it from the stove 90 seconds ago, but she took it back without argument and brought him a fresh one from the pot. Gerald caught her arm as she passed the bar. "You got enough back there to keep this going?" "Yes, sir." "Because I've got paying customers out there, and I don't want to hear you ran short." "I won't run short." He looked at her for a second with that measuring expression she hated. "You look worn out." It was not said with sympathy. "I'm fine," she said, and pulled her arm free gently and went back to the kitchen. But she didn't notice him come in. That was the truth of it, and she told it to herself honestly later. She was so deep in the work of managing 6 things at once on a stove that wasn't big enough that she genuinely did not notice the door open for the 7th or 8th time that night, did not hear the specific sound of boots that had walked a very long way, did not register the new weight settling at the end of the bar. The first she knew of Silas Crow was when Gerald appeared in the kitchen doorway, with a look on his face that she'd never quite seen before, somewhere between wariness and wanting to seem like he wasn't wary. "Got a man just in from the North Pass," Gerald said. "Says he's been walking since morning." Eleanor ladled chili into a bowl. "I'll send out what we have." "He's asking about the cornbread specifically." She paused, just for a half second. "Asking what about it?" "Just what's in it. Asked me who made it." Gerald shifted his weight in the doorway. "I told him the cook." She waited for the rest of that sentence. There wasn't any. She put the cornbread on the plate next to the chili, added the last of the preserved beans, and handed it to Gerald without a word. He took it and left. She went back to the stove. 20 minutes later, when the rush had thinned and the storm was howling hard enough outside that even the most restless men had settled into their drinks and stopped demanding things, she heard the kitchen door. Not the saloon door, the kitchen door. Customers didn't come into the kitchen. There was no reason for them to come into the kitchen. It wasn't a thing that happened. She turned around with a rag in her hands, ready to say something sharp to whatever drunk cowboy had lost his way, and found a man standing in her kitchen who did not look like a drunk cowboy. He was tall, genuinely tall, not the kind of tall that was just a hat, with a mountain man's build that came from actual physical work rather than performing strength. His coat was coated in snow, partly melted now. His beard was thick and dark with a streak of silver through it that hadn't been there from age, but from a scar she could see running along his jaw. His eyes were dark gray, the color of the sky outside, and they were looking directly at her in a way that made her automatically brace herself. Because when men looked directly at Eleanor Briggs, it was usually to tell her something she didn't want to hear. "I'm sorry to come back here," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that was used to speaking only when it had something to say. "I asked the man out there who cooked tonight, and he gave me a name." "Eleanor?" She stood very still. "That's me. I wanted to say something to you directly." He paused, and she could see him working out how to say the next part, not performing politeness, actually working it out. "That cornbread. I've been in these mountains for 4 years. I've eaten a lot of bad food and some decent food, and twice in that time something that was actually good. Tonight was—" He stopped again. "I just didn't want to leave without saying something to the person who made it. That's all." Eleanor stared at him. She had been cooking in this saloon for 3 years. In 3 years, not one person had come into her kitchen to say something like that. Not one. She didn't know what to do with it. Her first instinct, the instinct that had been honed by 3 years of survival in this place, was to look for the angle. People said nice things when they wanted something. People went out of their way when there was a reason. She searched his face for the smirk, for the joke waiting to be revealed, for the other men crowded outside the door, about to burst in laughing. There was nothing like that. He was just standing in her kitchen, still in his snow-soaked coat, waiting to see if she'd say anything back. "It's the bacon fat," she heard herself say, "and a little honey. Most people use plain lard, but the bacon fat gives it a different—" She stopped herself, suddenly aware she was explaining her recipe to a stranger who hadn't asked. "Anyway, it's nothing special." He looked at her steadily. "That's not true." She didn't know what to say to that either. "Silas Crow," he said, and offered his hand across her kitchen workbench. Eleanor looked at the hand. She was holding a dirty rag. Her hands were flour-dusted and probably smelled like onions. She almost made an excuse. Instead, she reached out and shook it, firm the way her father had taught her handshakes should be, before everything. "Eleanor Briggs." He nodded. Then he looked around the kitchen, not with the critical look Gerald always had, cataloging things to complain about, but with something more like attention, like he was actually seeing the space. "You do all this yourself?" he asked. "Tonight I did." He didn't say that's impressive in the way people sometimes did to mean that's a lot for someone like you. He just took it in, and there was something in the way he received that information, quietly, without fanfare, the way a person absorbs a fact that already makes sense, that made something shift slightly in Eleanor's chest. It wasn't a large shift. It was small enough that she could almost ignore it. But she noticed it. Outside, the storm roared against the walls of the Red Coyote saloon, and 32 men drank and argued and paid Gerald Hatch for the privilege of staying warm. And inside the kitchen, for the first time in 3 years, Eleanor Briggs stood in her own space and felt, briefly and strangely, like someone worth noticing. She went back to the stove. She had cobbler to check, but her hands were steadier than they'd been all night, and she didn't entirely understand why. He left before she woke up the next morning. She knew this not because she'd been watching for him, but because she heard Gerald's voice carry through the thin walls separating the kitchen from the saloon sometime around 5 in the morning, grumbling to himself about the fire needing wood. And when she came out to start breakfast, there was no sign of Silas Crow at any of the tables, no coat on the rack by the door, no boots drying near the hearth, just the empty chair where he'd sat and a single coin left on the bar top. More than the meal cost, she noticed, though she told herself it didn't matter. She told herself a lot of things didn't matter, and she believed most of them. The storm had broken sometime in the night. The world outside was buried under 14 inches of fresh snow, white and brutal and indifferent to everything that had happened inside the Red Coyote Saloon the previous evening. The miners filed out by 7, complaining about the cold, anxious to get back to their claims before the ice set harder. The cowboys followed. Peterson, the salesman with the frozen mustache, ate 3 bowls of leftover chili for breakfast without thanking anyone and left without tipping. By 8 o'clock, the saloon was empty, and Eleanor was alone with the dirty dishes and the quiet. She stood at the kitchen sink with her hands in the wash water and thought about what Silas Crow had said. That's not true. 2 words. 3 syllables. The man had been in her kitchen for less than 10 minutes, and he'd said maybe 40 words total, and somehow those 2, said in response to her calling her own cooking nothing special, were the ones that stayed. She turned them over in her mind the way you turn a stone over looking for what's underneath, half expecting to find something unpleasant there, some catch she'd missed. But there wasn't one. He'd just said it the way a person says something they believe without needing to convince anyone of it. She scrubbed a bowl that was already clean and put it in the drying rack. She had been called a lot of things in Bitter Creek. Some of it was direct. Gerald's particular brand of cruelty was always specific, always aimed, the way cruelty from someone in power tends to be. Some of it was sideways, the kind that came wrapped in smiles and could be dismissed if you tried hard enough. But nothing special had been her own voice. She was the one who said that about herself. She'd been saying it so long she'd stopped noticing she was saying it at all. She dried her hands and went to start the bread for lunch. But something had shifted, just barely, just at the edges. The way the temperature changes by 2 degrees before you realize the season is turning. She couldn't have named it exactly. She just noticed that she measured the flour a little more carefully than usual, that she took her time with the salt, that when she pulled the first loaf from the oven and it came out exactly right, brown on top, still soft in the middle, the way she'd learned to judge by the smell alone, she held it in her hands for a moment longer than necessary, like she was actually looking at what she'd made. Gerald Hatch noticed the change before Eleanor could have named it herself, and he didn't like it. He came into the kitchen 3 days after the storm with a cut of elk that someone had traded him, tossed it on her workbench without asking if she was in the middle of something, and told her to figure out what to do with it by dinner. She looked at the cut. It was tough, probably from a young bull killed badly. She could tell from the way the muscle was torn rather than clean. It would need at least 4 hours of slow heat to be edible, and it was already past noon. "This won't be ready by dinner," she said. "Make it ready." "Mr. Hatch, tough elk doesn't get tender just because you want it to. It takes time." He turned and looked at her with the particular expression he had when he was surprised by her having an opinion. It had been happening more lately, her saying the second sentence, the one that followed up the first, instead of trailing off into silence. He didn't like it. She could see that clearly. "You giving me cooking lessons now?" he said. "No, sir. I'm telling you it'll be dry and chewy and the men won't want it, and then you'll blame me for serving something they don't want." He was quiet for a moment. "Then serve it with enough gravy that they don't notice." "The gravy won't fix tough meat." "Eleanor," his voice had that edge again, "I don't pay you to argue with me about what gravy can and can't do." She looked at the elk. She looked at the clock on the wall. She made her calculation the way she always made her calculations, quietly, internally, without letting him see it. "I can braise it," she said finally. Low heat with some onion and the last of the winter sage. It won't be perfect by dinner, but it'll be better than you think." Gerald looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked out without saying anything, which was the closest he ever came to saying fine. She started on the onions, but she noticed something about the conversation afterward. She'd said it won't be perfect. Not, "I'm sorry, it won't be better," or "I'll do my best." She'd stated a fact. Quietly, without apology, without trying to make him feel better about it. She'd said what was true and stopped talking. That was different from what she normally did. She wasn't sure if she was glad about it or worried. Winona came by on a Tuesday with a bundle of dried juniper berries and a look on her face that suggested she had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. Eleanor put the kettle on without being asked. They sat at the small table in the corner of the kitchen, the one Eleanor used during the gaps between meals when she had 20 minutes to herself, and Winona set the juniper berries between them and wrapped both hands around the cup when it came. "There's talk," Winona said, without preamble, because Winona didn't use preamble any more than she used pleasantries she didn't mean. Eleanor waited. "About the man who came in during the storm, the trapper from the North Pass." Eleanor kept her face neutral. "What kind of talk?" "The kind men make when they don't have enough to do." Winona took a sip. "Hatch was telling Denny Ferris you'd been entertaining a stranger in your kitchen." The word entertaining landed with the weight it was meant to carry. Eleanor's jaw tightened. "He came back to thank me for the food." "I know that." "He was there for 10 minutes." "I know that too." Winona put her cup down and looked at Eleanor directly. "I'm not telling you because I believe it. I'm telling you because Hatch is telling it, and Hatch tells things for reasons." Eleanor stared at the table, her fingers curled around her cup. Gerald Hatch didn't spread stories without purpose. He was many things, but idle wasn't one of them. If he was saying something, it was because he wanted something, usually to reduce a person, to remind them of their place, to make sure anyone who might think better of them started thinking worse instead. She'd survived 3 years in this saloon partly by staying below the line of his attention, by being useful without being noticed, by not giving him a reason. A man coming into her kitchen and saying that's not true, that was a reason. Small as it was visible. And visible things in Gerald Hatch's saloon became targets. "What do you think I should do?" Eleanor asked. Winona considered this with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime not rushing answers. "I think you should keep doing what you're doing," she said finally, "and I think you should be careful." It wasn't much of an answer, but it was an honest one, and Eleanor had learned to value honesty over comfort a long time ago. After Winona left, Eleanor sat in the kitchen alone for a while before the supper rush, and she thought about what being careful meant. She'd been careful for 3 years. She'd been so careful she'd nearly disappeared. And what had it cost her? Not safety. Gerald was still cruel, still made her feel small, still took credit for everything she produced. Being careful had just made her easier to ignore. She got up and started on the supper cornbread. She added a little more honey than usual, not because anyone would notice, just because she wanted to. The week before Christmas, Gerald cut her flour ration. She discovered it in the morning when she went to the pantry and found the barrel only a quarter full when it should have been half. She stood in front of it for a full minute trying to determine if she'd somehow used more than she'd thought. She hadn't. She kept track in her head with the precision of someone who knew exactly what it cost to run short, and she had not run short. She found Gerald in the main room restacking bottles. "The flour barrel's low," she said. "Mm-hmm. I had half a barrel this time last week. Supply wagon got held up. We're rationing through January." He didn't turn around. "I can't cook a proper meal on a quarter barrel of flour through January. That's 3 weeks. "Then cook less." "The men won't—" "Eleanor." He set a bottle down with a sharp click that meant the conversation was over in his estimation. "The men will eat what I tell them they're getting. This is a business. You work for the business. Start cooking accordingly." She stood there, and she felt the old response rising up in her. The swallow, the nod, the retreat to the kitchen, the silence that meant surrender. And underneath it, something else. Something that had been waking up slowly since the night of the storm, since a man with a silver-streaked beard had stood in her kitchen and told her that nothing special was not the truth. Marta at the dry goods still has flour, she said. If we ran short, we could— I know what Marta has. He turned around now, and his eyes had that flat, assessing quality that meant he'd decided to make a point. I also know what Marta charges, and I decide what this saloon spends. Not you. She held his gaze for 1 second longer than she normally would have. Then she went back to the kitchen. She didn't argue further, but she did something she'd never done before. She found a piece of paper in the bottom of her apron pocket, the kind she used to write shopping lists when she had the chance, and she started keeping track. Dates, amounts, what was missing, what had been cut. She folded the paper small and kept it tucked under the loose board beneath her cot, where she also kept her $11, which had grown, slowly, steadily, one saved coin at a time, to $53 and change. She wasn't sure what she was going to do with any of it, but she wrote it down anyway. January came in mean and stayed mean. Eleanor had learned early on that a Dakota winter didn't progress so much as accumulate, each cold day adding its weight to the one before until you'd stopped thinking in terms of it ending and started just moving through it, one morning at a time. The Red Coyote filled up most nights because there was nowhere else to go and nothing else to do, which was good for Gerald's whiskey sales and hard on Eleanor's diminishing pantry. She adapted. That was the thing about Eleanor that even Gerald, in his worst moments, couldn't argue with. She adapted. She stretched the flour with cornmeal. She made broth from bones she'd been saving for weeks and used it to make things go further than they had any right to. She found ways to feed 30 people with the supplies of 20, and she did it without the food tasting like deprivation, which was its own kind of miracle, though she wouldn't have used that word. She would have said it was just math and stubbornness. But she was tired. Genuinely, bone-deep tired in a way that sleep didn't entirely fix anymore. She was tired of the cold coming through the gap under the kitchen door that she'd stuffed with a rag 3 times, and it kept working loose. She was tired of Gerald's voice. She was tired of being invisible to 30 people at a time. She was tired of cooking meals that made men close their eyes on the first bite and never once wonder where such a meal had come from. She was tired, too, of thinking about Silas Crow, which she told herself she wasn't doing and then caught herself doing with enough regularity to be irritating. He'd said he came through this territory in winter and again in spring. It was January. He had a long way to go before spring, and so did she. The incident with Roy Decker happened on a Thursday in the second week of January. Roy Decker was a miner who had been in Bitter Creek since August, which was long enough to have developed opinions about the way things worked at the Red Coyote. He was not a bad man exactly. Eleanor had seen bad men, and Roy was more careless than cruel. But careless people could do a great deal of damage without ever meaning to, which was almost worse because you couldn't even be cleanly angry at them. He came into the kitchen. Not the way Silas had come in. Quietly, hat in hand, words thought out. Roy pushed the door open with his shoulder because he was carrying his empty bowl and didn't bother to knock. "Need more of that stew," he said. "Leave your bowl on the bar," Eleanor said, not turning from the stove. "I'll send it out." "Just fill it up while I'm here. Easier." "Customers don't come in the kitchen, Mr. Decker." "Don't see why not." He leaned against the doorframe with the easy confidence of someone who'd never once thought about whether he was welcome somewhere. "Hatch doesn't care." "I care." He laughed, not meanly, but carelessly. The laugh of someone who finds another person's preferences mildly amusing. "Come on, Ellie, my name is Eleanor," she said, and she turned around. Something in her face, or her voice, or the combination of the two, made Roy Decker stop mid-sentence. He looked at her the way people sometimes looked at a piece of furniture that had spoken, startled, uncertain how to recalibrate. "All right," he said, after a moment. "Sorry. Eleanor. Leave your bowl on the bar." He left. She heard him say something to whoever was nearest. She couldn't make out the words. And then there was a low laugh from that corner of the room that she chose not to interpret. She stood at the stove for a moment with her eyes closed. Her heart was beating faster than she'd like. Not from fear, or not only from fear, from something that felt uncomfortably like the moment after you've said a thing out loud that you've been not saying for too long. The adrenaline of consequence. She'd told a man in that saloon her actual name. She'd held the boundary of her own kitchen. It should not have been remarkable. It should have been the smallest possible thing. The fact that it felt large told her everything about how small she'd been letting herself live. Roy Decker got his stew. She sent it out without comment. He ate it and left a coin tip, which he hadn't done before. She put the coin in her apron pocket and didn't analyze what it meant. February was when Gerald started in on her appearance. He'd always made comments, the kind that were designed to sound like observations rather than attacks, the kind that made it hard to object to directly without being accused of being oversensitive. "You're not exactly built for speed," he'd said once, watching her carry a heavy pot. "Good thing you cook well," he'd said another time, looking her up and down with the particular expression of a man who believed his visual appraisal of a woman was a form of honest assessment. But February brought something more deliberate. It started because a group of men came through Bitter Creek heading to the Northern Territories. 7 of them, all young, all loud in the way of men who were young and in a group and trying to impress each other. They ate well, drank more, and one of them made a joke about the cook that Eleanor heard from the kitchen because he'd made it loud enough to be heard from the kitchen. She didn't react. She'd built walls thick enough for that. But Gerald laughed at the joke. Not the small, obligatory laugh of a man managing his customers, but a real laugh, sharp and genuine. And then, the next morning when they were alone and she was starting on the breakfast, he said to her, "You know, if you didn't let yourself go like that, you'd probably have an easier time of things." She turned from the stove slowly. He was leaning against the door frame in that proprietary way he had of occupying space in rooms that weren't his particular concern, arms folded, looking at her with the expression of a man who believed he was doing her a favor. "I haven't gone anywhere," she said. "I'm just saying. A woman in your position, men around all day. You might think about the impression you make." "The impression I make," Eleanor repeated, "it's just a thought." She looked at him. She looked at him for long enough that he shifted slightly, which was rare. Gerald wasn't a man who shifted under another person's gaze. "My position," she said carefully, "is that I cook every meal in this establishment. I have for 3 years, and your business has improved every year I've been here. The impression I make on these men is that the food here is worth coming back for." She paused. "That's the only impression that's your business." The silence afterward was different from the usual silence. Gerald's jaw worked slightly. He wasn't used to sentences that came back at him with their logic intact. "Watch yourself," he said finally. "Yes, sir," she said, and turned back to the stove. Her hands were trembling slightly. She gripped the handle of the pan until they stopped. She cooked the best breakfast she'd made in weeks that morning, not out of spite. Spite produced sloppy cooking. She'd always believed that. She cooked it well because it was hers to cook well, and no amount of Gerald Hatch standing in the doorway was going to change what she put into a pan. But she also went back to the piece of paper under the loose board that night, and she wrote down the date, and she wrote down what he'd said, and she underlined it. She wasn't sure why. She just felt, in the gathering quiet of the Dakota winter, that some things were worth keeping a record of, that some things should not exist only in a woman's memory, where they could be doubted, diminished, told back to her sideways as "you're too sensitive, and that's not what I meant." She put the paper back. She lay on her cot with $53 and change, and 3 years of other people's hunger, and her own particular talent hidden under a loose board, and she listened to the wind push hard against the outside walls of the Red Coyote Saloon. Spring was a long time away, but for the first time in 3 years, Eleanor Briggs was counting towards something rather than just counting days. Spring came to Bitter Creek the way it always did in the Dakota Territory, not as a relief, but as a negotiation. The snow didn't so much melt as it retreated, grudgingly, inch by inch, leaving behind mud so thick it swallowed boot heels and made the main road through town look like something a river had abandoned in disgust. The temperature climbed to 50 degrees and then dropped back to 22 overnight, twice in the same week, as if the season hadn't quite committed to the change yet and kept second-guessing itself. Eleanor noticed spring the way she noticed most things, through her work. The dried herbs she'd been rationing since October started coming back in new growth along the creek bank where she walked sometimes in the early morning before the saloon woke up. She found the first wild onions in the 3rd week of March, thin and sharp-smelling, pushing up through the frozen mud with a determination she found privately admirable. She took what she needed and left the rest, the way her mother had taught her when she was small, back when she still had a mother and a home and a life that had felt like it belonged to her. She thought about her mother sometimes in the early mornings, not with grief exactly. Grief had a heat to it, and this was something cooler, more settled, more like acknowledgement. Her mother had been a practical woman who cooked well and was largely ignored for it by the same people who depended on it, which Eleanor recognized now as a pattern she had simply stepped into without seeing it coming. It was the kind of thought that could make a person angry or sad or both. Eleanor usually chose to just cook something. The piece of paper under the loose board had gotten longer. She'd moved it to a folded envelope in late February because the paper was filling up, and she'd been adding to it almost without thinking. Dates, amounts, specific things said, specific things done. She told herself it was just a record. She wasn't sure what record it was exactly, or who might ever read it, but she kept it anyway, and it had started to feel like a form of dignity, like proof that things had happened the way she knew they'd happened. Gerald had moved into a quieter phase of cruelty in March, which was almost worse. He didn't say things to her face. He just stopped acknowledging her directly, walked past her in the kitchen without speaking, responded to her questions through the barmaid he'd recently hired, a nervous young woman named Sadie, who clearly hated being in the middle and showed it by looking at the floor constantly. When Eleanor asked about supplies, Sadie delivered the answer. When Eleanor needed to tell Gerald something, she told Sadie, who told Gerald, who sometimes responded and sometimes didn't. It was a particular kind of erasure, the kind that didn't leave marks. Eleanor kept cooking. She kept the food excellent because that was the one thing in the Red Coyote that was genuinely hers, and she was not going to let Gerald Hatch's silent treatment turn her pan bread into something mediocre. She owed that much to herself, if nothing else. She had not stopped thinking about Silas Crow, though she'd gotten better at managing where that thinking went. She allowed herself to remember the conversation in her kitchen during the storm, the specific sound of his voice, the way he'd offered his hand without looking at hers first to decide if it was worth shaking. She allowed herself to remember that's not true with the same care she used when she took down the good skillet, the one she kept clean separately and used only when a dish deserved it. But she'd also been careful not to build something out of nothing. One conversation in a kitchen during a blizzard, a man who had been passing through. She was 34 years old and she had been here before, not with Silas, but with the architecture of hope itself. The way it could be constructed out of almost no materials and still feel solid enough to fall from. She wasn't going to fall from anything. If he came back, he came back. If he didn't, she'd be here, cooking, counting the coins under the loose board, writing things down. He came back on the 12th of April. She knew it before she saw him, which she couldn't have explained to anyone's satisfaction and didn't try to. She'd been rolling out biscuit dough and heard the saloon door open with the particular hesitation of someone who wasn't sure of their welcome, which was different from the way regulars push through. And she'd known. The same way she knew when the bread was right by the smell 2 minutes before she needed to check it. Something that was less than thought and more than instinct. She didn't go out to look. She kept rolling. It was Sadie who came back to tell her, visibly uncertain about how to deliver the information. "There's a man asking for you," she said from the kitchen doorway. "The tall one with the beard. He brought something. I don't know what they are." "Tell him I'll be out when I reach a stopping point," Eleanor said. She kept rolling for approximately 90 more seconds, which was how long she needed to get the dough even. Then she washed her hands. Then she went out. Silas Crow was standing at the far end of the bar, and he'd brought spring in with him the way trappers sometimes did. The smell of open air and pine resin and wood smoke, something so different from the stale interior of the saloon that several men nearby had looked up without knowing why. On the bar in front of him was a cloth bundle, opened at the top to reveal what was clearly a collection of dried and fresh herbs bundled together. Some she recognized immediately, some she didn't. He saw her come out of the kitchen, and he nodded, the same way he'd nodded when she told him her name. Like a fact confirmed. "I said I'd come back in spring," he said. "You did," she agreed. He gestured at the bundle. "I went north again in February. High country. There's a slope above the tree line on the eastern face where things come up early. He picked out one of the bundles she didn't recognize, small purple flowers, dried with a woody stem. This is mountain thyme, different from what you'd get from a supply wagon, stronger. I didn't know if you'd have use for it, but I thought— He stopped, reconsidered. I thought you probably would. Eleanor looked at the herbs, then she looked at him. Something in her chest pulled tight in a way she recognized as dangerous and did not address directly. I've never cooked with mountain thyme, she said. I know. I've never eaten anything made with it. He paused. I figured between the two of us, we'd probably figure out something. The casual between the two of us landed somewhere in Eleanor's sternum and stayed there, and she made a decision in that moment to simply not examine it until later, when she was alone. Come have something to eat, she said. I'll look at these while you do. She brought his meal herself. The venison she'd been slow cooking since morning with the last of the dried rosemary, a side of the early spring onions she'd found that week, sautéed with a little salt pork fat, and cornbread because it seemed important and she didn't analyze why. She brought a cup of coffee without being asked. He ate the way she'd remembered, with full attention, not performing it, just genuinely present with the food in a way that very few people were. She'd noticed over 3 years that most men ate at the Red Coyote as a necessity between other activities, the way they watered their horses. Silas ate like he understood what had gone into a thing. She sat across from him, which she never did with customers, and spread the herbs out on the table between them. This one I know, she said, touching the mountain thyme. My grandmother grew something like it. She called it a different name. She picked up another bundle. Gray-green leaves, unfamiliar. What's this? Sage from the high country. It's different from the low-ground stuff. Less bitter. She brought it to her nose. It was different, cleaner. She put it down and thought about what she'd do with it. And these? She pointed to a smaller bundle, almost black when dried, with tiny leaves. I don't know what they're called. An old crow trapper showed them to me 8 years ago, said they were good for meat. I've been using them ever since. He looked at the bundle. I realize that's not very helpful information for a cook. It's honest information, she said. That's more useful. He looked at her then, across the herbs and the coffee cups, and the particular afternoon light coming sideways through the saloon's dirty windows. And there was something in his expression that was careful and direct at the same time. The expression of a man who had things to say and was deciding on the order. How are you? He asked. Actually, the question was so straightforward and so unusual that Eleanor felt a stab of something she could not immediately categorize. Nobody asked her that. Not Marta, who asked practical questions. Not Winona, who communicated more through presence than inquiry. Not Gerald, obviously. Not anyone. She thought about what honest looked like. Tired, she said, but better than I was. He nodded slowly. Better how? She looked at the table. I started saying what I think, more than I used to. She glanced up. It's harder than you'd expect. No, he said. I'd expect it to be exactly that hard. They talked for 2 hours. She hadn't talked to anyone for 2 hours in years, possibly not since before Yankton, and what struck her most was that it didn't feel like performing conversation, like the way talking to most people felt, where you managed what you said and how you said it and whether you were being too much of something or not enough. It felt like thinking out loud to someone who was actually listening, which was its own kind of revelation. He told her about the mountain, not romantically, not the way men sometimes described wild places as if they were recounting a personal victory. He described it the way he lived in it, practically, specifically, with an attention to detail that suggested a person who had spent years actually observing rather than narrating. The elevation where firewood burned differently, the particular shelf of rock on the eastern face that caught enough southern light to stay 10 degrees warmer than everywhere around it. The creek that ran from the snowmelt and went cold in late summer and came back in spring. You built a cabin, she said. She remembered him mentioning it during the storm. She'd filed it away without meaning to. Finished it in November. It took longer than I planned. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. The floor took 3 weeks by itself because I kept second-guessing the leveling. She almost smiled. You second-guessed yourself for 3 weeks about a floor. I was going to have to live on it for a long time, he said. Seemed worth getting right. There was a quality to the way he said a long time that made Eleanor pay close attention to the table surface. Gerald appeared in the kitchen doorway at some point during the second hour and saw Eleanor sitting at a table with a customer and looked at the scene with the exact expression she'd have predicted. A quick narrowing of calculation behind the eyes, the kind that didn't have to do with jealousy or morality or anything that complicated. It was simpler than that. Gerald's expression was the expression of a man recalculating an asset he thought was fixed and finding out it might have a different value than he'd assigned. He didn't say anything. He went back to what he was doing. But Eleanor felt it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather. Silas stayed in Bitter Creek 3 days that trip. He ate at the Red Coyote each evening and occasionally at midday. He talked to Eleanor when she had time and didn't crowd her when she didn't. He helped Roy Decker's partner pull a wagon out of the spring mud on the second day, which was entirely unasked and apparently unremarkable to him, the way useful people do useful things without needing it noticed. On the second evening, he came to the kitchen door again, knocked this time, which she'd noticed he'd done even the first time, and said he'd been thinking about the mountain thyme. "What about it?" she asked. "What if you used it in the cornbread, instead of the honey?" She stared at him. "That's a completely different flavor profile." "I know." He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed, the posture of a man offering an idea, not an instruction. "But the thyme from up there has something sweet underneath the herb. I don't know how to describe it. I kept thinking about whether it would work." She thought about it. She'd been thinking about the herbs since he'd put them on the table. "Come back tomorrow morning early," she said, "before the breakfast rush. We'll try it." He came at 5:30, before the light was properly up. She'd already started the fire and had everything measured. They made 2 batches, one her standard recipe, one with the mountain thyme worked in and the honey reduced by half. She watched him taste the standard one first. Wait, taste the second. His face was serious and genuinely uncertain, which she found more trustworthy than enthusiasm. "The second one," he said finally. "But not by as much as I thought." "The thyme needs something acidic to open it up," she said. "A little buttermilk. Maybe some—" She was already moving, already thinking, already pulling the next thing toward her. He stood back and let her work without trying to help, which was exactly right, and she registered it without breaking stride. The third batch was different. She could tell before it came out of the oven from the way it smelled. A complexity she hadn't achieved before, something that was hers and also something that had come from a mountain she'd never seen. She cut 2 pieces and handed him one without ceremony. The silence when he tasted it was the best kind of silence, the kind that meant the food had used up all the available attention. "Eleanor," he said after a moment. "I know," she said, because she did. Damn. On the morning of the third day, Gerald Hatch made his move. It was earlier than Eleanor expected. She'd thought he'd wait until Silas left, do whatever he was going to do in the aftermath rather than the middle. But Gerald had apparently decided he'd rather act with Silas still present, which told her he'd been thinking about this more carefully than she'd given him credit for. He came into the kitchen before the breakfast rush, when Eleanor was alone, and he closed the door behind him, which he'd never done before. "I need to talk to you about your friend," he said. "He's a customer," Eleanor said without turning around. "He's been in here 3 days and he's bought 4 meals. That's not a customer. That's a house guest." Gerald's voice was the controlled version of itself, the one he used when he'd decided to be strategic. "I'm also hearing he was in your kitchen 2 mornings. He came to try a recipe. It was before business hours." "This is my business establishment, Eleanor. There are no hours when it isn't my business establishment." She turned around. He was standing with his back to the closed door, arms at his sides, and she understood the staging. She was on one side. He was between her and the exit, and he'd framed it that way on purpose. "What is it you want to say, Mr. Hatch?" she asked. "I want to say that you work for me, that you live here, under my roof, and that the situation you have here is comfortable, steady, more than a woman in your circumstances might find elsewhere." He paused to let that land. I wouldn't want you to get confused about that, about what you have here, because of someone passing through." She looked at him. "He's not passing through anymore," she said. "He built a cabin." Gerald's jaw tightened slightly. "That's so. North Pass. Eastern face." Silence. Gerald recalculated something behind his eyes. "You seem to know a great deal about this man's living situation," he said, and the word living carried an implication she chose to address directly. "He told me about it while he was eating the food I cooked," she said. "The food that keeps this saloon full enough that you've raised your prices twice in 2 years." She kept her voice level. Not aggressive, she wasn't interested in a fight she couldn't win, just factual the way she'd been practicing. "I'll keep cooking what I cook, and whoever comes in to eat it is a paying customer." Gerald held the stare for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he said, "Watch how much time you spend talking to him," and opened the kitchen door and left. Eleanor stood still until she heard his footsteps cross the main room. Then she sat down at her corner table just for a minute and pressed both hands flat on the surface and breathed. He was afraid of something. She could see it now under the control and the calculation. Gerald Hatch was afraid of something shifting, and he didn't know how to stop it, so he was trying to freeze it in place with warnings. She'd lived in this kitchen for 3 years like a piece of furniture that had learned to cook. She'd been invisible, and she'd been quiet, and she'd been grateful for 32 cents a day and a storage closet with a hook on the wall. And it had felt like the best available arrangement because she'd never thought to look at the edges of it and ask what was actually holding it together. She was looking now. What? Silas found her that afternoon near the creek where she sometimes walked, which surprised her because she hadn't told him about the walks. But he'd seen her head in that direction and followed at enough distance to not make it a chase. "Mind if I walk with you?" he asked, pulling up beside her. "Already there," she said. They walked without talking for a while, which she'd found was one of the things she could do with him that she couldn't do with most people. Inhabit a silence without it needing to be filled. The creek was running high from snowmelt, brown and fast and loud enough that you had to lean slightly toward whoever was speaking to be heard. "Gerald spoke to me this morning," Silas said eventually. She looked at him. "He spoke to you?" "On my way out. Told me it was a fine establishment and that he appreciated the custom, but that his cook had a lot of work, and he'd appreciate me not distracting her from it." He said it without inflection, the flat recounting of a thing that had happened. He used the word distracting. He also mentioned that you'd been with the saloon a long time and that he thought of you as... Silas paused. He used the phrase, part of the place. Eleanor stopped walking. Part of the place. As if she were the stove, as if she were the sticky floors or the sign with the missing letter. "He doesn't want me to leave," she said. Not a question. The thing clarifying itself as she said it out loud. "No, he doesn't." Silas had stopped beside her. He was looking at the creek, not at her, in the way he had of giving her space to think inside a conversation. He's smart enough not to say it like that, but that's what it was. She stood at the edge of the swollen creek and felt things moving in her that she didn't have clean words for. Anger was part of it, clear and justified. But underneath the anger was something more complicated. The particular discomfort of realizing that a cage you'd been calling a shelter was still a cage regardless of the name. "He told me I was comfortable here," she said. "Are you?" She thought about the storage closet, the hook on the wall, the 32 cents, now adjusted to 38 after 2 years of not acknowledging her contribution out loud, the piece of paper in the envelope under the loose board with all the dates and the specific words. "No," she said. "I don't think I have been for a long time." Silas was quiet. The creek moved fast and cold between its banks. "I want to say something to you," he said, "and I want to say it plainly, because I think you deserve plain over polished." She turned to look at him. He met her eyes with the same directness he'd had in her kitchen in December, when she'd expected cruelty and gotten something completely different. "The cabin has 2 rooms," he said. "I told you I second-guessed the floor for 3 weeks. I didn't tell you I second-guessed the second room for longer than that, because I wasn't sure I had any right to build it for the reason I was building it." He stopped. I'm not asking you to decide anything today. I'm not asking you to decide anything tomorrow. I just want you to know that when I came back to Bitter Creek in spring, it wasn't for the food." Eleanor stood very still. The creek ran loud, and the early spring air was cold enough that she could see her breath, and she was 34 years old, and she'd been invisible for so long that someone seeing her clearly felt almost physically disorienting. "You barely know me," she said. "I know that you cook with conviction," he said. "I know that you hold your kitchen as a place of standards when everything around you is trying to lower them. I know that when someone spoke to you with basic respect, you looked at him like you were checking for the catch." He paused. "That last one tells me a great deal about what your life has looked like, and I know that you deserve better than what you've been accepting." The silence afterward was the kind that required no filling. "Let me think," she said finally. "Take all the time you need," he said. And he meant it. She could hear that he meant it, which was itself a kind of answer to a question she hadn't known she was asking. They walked back toward town in the failing afternoon light, and Eleanor Briggs thought about a floor that someone had leveled carefully for 3 weeks, and a second room that had been second-guessed even longer, and $53 in change under a loose board in a storage closet that had never once felt like home. She thought about a piece of paper full of dates and specific words that she'd been keeping as evidence of something, though she'd never let herself name what she was building a case for. She was beginning to think she knew. She slept badly that night, not from distress exactly, or not only from distress. It was more like her mind had been handed a problem it didn't know how to set down, and it kept turning it over in the dark the way she turned dough, looking for the resistance, testing the give. The cabin with 2 rooms. The floor leveled for 3 weeks. I wasn't sure I had any right to build it for the reason I was building it. She'd heard declarations before. Her husband had been full of them. Big, warm, convincing declarations that turned out to be the verbal equivalent of a house with no foundation. She'd learned to be suspicious of words that felt good going in. She'd learned that the things people said in the middle of a feeling and the things they did when the feeling passed were often 2 entirely different documents. But Silas Crow had not made a declaration. He'd stated a fact, plainly, as promised. And then he'd said, "Take all the time you need," and meant it well enough to walk back to town without pressing her for anything. She lay on her cot in the storage closet with the hook on the wall and stared at the ceiling and tried to be honest with herself the way she'd been practicing being honest with Gerald and Roy Decker and the world in general. What she was afraid of was not Silas. What she was afraid of was herself. Specifically, the part of herself that wanted this badly enough to make mistakes about it. She was 34 years old, and she had $53 and a talent and a storage closet, and a man she'd spoken to 4 times total across 5 months had told her he'd built a room for her. The sensible, careful, protective part of Eleanor Briggs said that women who left known bad situations for unknown good ones were gambling, and gambling on hope was how she'd ended up in Bitter Creek in the first place. The other part, the part that had started writing things down, that had told Roy Decker her actual name, that had looked Gerald Hatch in the eye and said the food is the only impression, that's your business. That part was tired of letting fear do all her deciding. She didn't sleep until close to 3 in the morning. She was up again at 4:30 to start the bread. Silas came for breakfast. He didn't come early the way he had for the cornbread experiment. He came at the regular hour with the 3 miners who'd been staying in town between supply runs and sat at a corner table and ate without making any particular point of acknowledging her, which she understood as consideration and appreciated as such. He wasn't going to crowd her decision by hovering over it. She sent out his meal herself: fried salt pork, biscuits, the last of the spring onion scrambled eggs. She set it down without looking at him and went back to the kitchen. Halfway through the morning, she made a mistake with the biscuits. Left them 2 minutes too long while she was working on something else, and they came out harder on the bottom than she'd have liked. She looked at them, considered her options, sent them out anyway with extra butter, and didn't say anything about it to anyone. Mistakes happened. You compensated and moved forward. That was cooking, and it was also most of the rest of life. Gerald came in around 9 and took his usual position at the end of the bar with his ledger and his coffee, and Eleanor could feel his attention on the room in the particular way she'd learned to feel it. Not looking at her directly, but oriented toward her, the way a man with a compass can feel which way is north, even when he's not checking. He was watching Silas. not aggressively. Gerald was too controlled for aggression before noon, but he was noting, calculating, keeping the kind of quiet tally that told Eleanor he'd moved from warning to planning overnight, the same way she had, just toward a different destination. She needed to decide, not because someone was forcing her hand, not yet, but because the situation was already moving with or without her participation, and she'd spent enough of her life being moved by situations rather than moving through them on her own terms. She pulled Sadie aside just before the breakfast rush cleared. "When Mr. Hatch goes to do his supply check," she said quietly, Gerald always did his weekly pantry inventory on Friday mornings, which was today, "I need 20 minutes. Sadie looked at her with the slightly panicked expression she often wore when placed between Eleanor and Gerald's gravitational fields. "For what?" "I need to talk to someone." Sadie opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "He'll notice if—" "20 minutes, Sadie. That's all." Sadie looked at the floor. Then, with the particular courage of someone who hated conflict more than they loved self-protection, she nodded. Eleanor took off her apron and folded it over the back of her kitchen chair, which she had never done mid-morning in 3 years, and walked out into the saloon. Silas looked up from his coffee when she came toward his table, and he read the situation in her face before she sat down, the way he had a habit of reading things without making a performance of it. "I've been thinking," she said. "I figured," he said. She sat down across from him and put her hands on the table and looked at them for a moment. Her hands were not the hands of a woman who had spent her life being careful. They were the hands of someone who worked with the specific wear that came from heat and heavy pans and cold water and years of exact repetition. She'd been self-conscious about them before. Right now, they just looked like evidence of what she'd built and what she was. "I want to ask you some things," she said, "and I want you to answer them honestly, including if the honest answer is something you think I won't want to hear." "All right," he said. "Have you done this before? Asked someone to come to the mountain with you?" "No." No pause, no qualification. "I've been alone up there for 4 years. I didn't think about changing that until December." "Until the cornbread," she said, and she heard the slight dryness in her own voice. The corner of his mouth moved. "The cornbread started it. The woman who made it, and then called it nothing special, is what kept it going." She let that sit for a moment without reacting. "I can't cook in a cabin the way I cook here," she said. "I don't mean I won't. I mean physically. Different equipment, different supplies. Things I rely on, I won't have access to." "I know." "I'm not saying that as a complaint. I'm saying it so you understand that what I do would look different there. It would take time to adapt. I'd need to build up what I had. I'd probably make bad meals while I was figuring out the conditions." "I know that too," he said. "I ate bad meals for 6 months after I got to the mountain. Burned things. Got the fire temperature wrong. It takes time to understand a new place." He paused. "I'm not expecting perfection." "I'm not worried about your expectations," she said, more sharply than she'd meant to. And then she caught herself. "I'm worried about mine. I have standards I hold myself to. They'd take a hit while I was adjusting, and I'd have to tolerate that. And I'm not always good at tolerating that." He looked at her with that steady, unhurried attention. "You're telling me you're hard on yourself. I'm telling you I'm aware of it, and I don't know how well I manage it." "That's more self-knowledge than most people have," he said. "I'll take it." She looked at the table. "Second question. If it doesn't work," she said carefully, "if it doesn't work between us for whatever reason, what happens to me? I'd have left here. I couldn't come back." She said it practically, not as emotional leverage. This was the real mathematics of the thing. "I'd have nothing to return to." Silas was quiet for a moment. This one he actually thought about, which she respected more than a fast answer. "If it doesn't work," he said, "I'd help you get somewhere better than here. I won't pretend I can guarantee what that looks like, but I wouldn't leave you without options." He looked at her directly. "I want to be clear that I'm not asking you to trade one bad situation for an uncertain one and pretend the uncertainty isn't there. It's there. The mountain is hard, and I'm not an easy man to live alongside, and I know that. But I don't think what I'm offering is worse than this." Eleanor sat with that. It wasn't a perfect answer. It wasn't the kind of answer that dissolved fear or made the math come out clean. It was an honest answer from a person who understood the limits of what he could promise, and that was worth more to her than any declaration. "I need 2 more weeks," she said. He nodded. "I can come back through." "Or you can stay in town," she said. "I'm not asking you to leave. I'm asking you to give me time to arrange some things." "What kind of things?" She looked at him. The kind a woman needs to arrange when she's been 3 years in a place and needs to leave it without leaving anything important behind. He understood. She could see it. He didn't ask what that meant specifically, which told her he trusted her to know her own situation, which was another item for the column she was keeping in her head, the one that was different from the paper in the envelope. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks, she confirmed. She got up, went back to the kitchen, picked up her apron, and tied it on. She had bread to finish. Her hands were steady. She went to see Winona that afternoon during the gap between lunch and dinner, walking the 1.5 miles to the small house on the eastern edge where Winona lived with her nephew, a quiet 11-year-old boy named Thomas, who was usually found doing something deliberate with wood scraps in the yard, and who acknowledged Eleanor's arrival with a nod that was so like his aunt's it made her smile. Winona was inside with a pot of something on the fire. She looked at Eleanor's face when she came through the door and said, "Sit down, I'll get another cup." Eleanor sat. "The trapper came back," Winona said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. And he built a cabin on the North Pass. 2 rooms. He asked me to come." Eleanor wrapped her hands around the cup that appeared in front of her. "I told him 2 weeks." Winona sat down across from her and was quiet in the way she was quiet when she was thinking rather than when she was withholding. "What does 2 weeks get you?" she asked finally. "Time to settle what I'm owed," Eleanor said. "Gerald's carried my wages loose since January. Hasn't been paying out weekly the way he's supposed to. Says he'll settle up at the end of the season. If I leave, I want what's mine first." Winona's expression shifted slightly. "He won't give it to you." "I know." She'd known that since January, really. "But I want to try the direct way before the other way." "What's the other way?" Eleanor thought about the piece of paper in the envelope, the dates, the specific amounts. The things said. "There's a land office in Pryor Creek," she said, "and a man there who handles labor disputes in the territory. I wrote to him in February." Winona looked at her for a long moment. "You wrote in February?" "I wasn't sure what I was writing toward, but I wrote it." Winona reached across the table and put her hand on Eleanor's briefly. One firm press, then back. It was as close as Winona came to an embrace, and Eleanor felt it land exactly as intended. "You've been planning this longer than you knew," Winona said. "I think so," Eleanor said. "Yes." She asked Gerald for her back wages on a Wednesday. She had chosen Wednesday deliberately, not a weekend when the saloon was packed and he was busy and would dismiss her quickly, and not a Monday when he always came in irritable from the weekend accounting. Wednesday mid-morning was when Gerald was most manageable, which was still not particularly manageable, but it was the best available window. She found him in the main room with his ledger and laid out the accounting clearly, the way she'd rehearsed it. 14 weeks at 38 cents a day, 7 days a week. She had the figure written on a piece of paper, $37.24, and she set it on the bar in front of him. Gerald looked at the paper, then he looked at her. "Where'd you get those numbers?" he said. "I've been keeping track," she said. "I settle wages at season's end. You know that." "You said seasons end in January and it's April." "The season ends in summer. That's when the miners clear out." "That wasn't the arrangement when you hired me," she said. "The arrangement was weekly, Mr. Hatch." Gerald closed his ledger with a deliberateness that was meant to communicate something. "You've gotten awful particular lately about arrangements," he said. She kept her face neutral. "I'd like what's owed to me." "And if I say you'll get it when I said you'd get it?" "Then I'd like that in writing," she said, with the amount acknowledged. The silence after that had a different quality than the usual silences between them. Gerald was staring at her and doing calculations she couldn't see, and she stood at the bar and let him stare because she wasn't going to be the one who blinked. "You're planning on leaving," he said. She hadn't said it yet, She wasn't going to confirm it under these circumstances. I'm planning on being paid what I'm owed, she said. Gerald leaned back and looked at her with the full assessment, the one that was meant to remind her what he saw when he looked at her: the weight, the worn apron, the storage closet, the position she occupied in his establishment that he could fill with someone else or leave empty because summer was coming and men didn't need as much feeding in the heat. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Maybe," she said. "Can I have my wages, Mr. Hatch?" "Not today." She picked up her piece of paper. "All right," she said, and she went back to the kitchen. She cooked a perfect lunch. The letter from the land office in Pryor Creek arrived the following Tuesday. Sadie brought it back from the postal drop with wide eyes and handed it to Eleanor without a word, which meant she'd seen who it was from, which meant Gerald would know about it by the end of the day. Eleanor read it in the kitchen. The man from the land office, a territorial labor commissioner named August Pell, had written back in February acknowledging her letter and explaining that disputes over withheld wages in the territory required either a signed witness or documented accounting. He had written again in March asking for the accounting she'd mentioned. This was his third letter, confirming he'd received her documented records and that under territorial labor provisions, wages withheld beyond 30 days past the standard payment schedule constituted a recoverable debt, and that if she wished to pursue it, she should arrive in Pryor Creek with her documentation. Pryor Creek was 42 miles east. She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket and went back to the bread she was making. And she kept making it with full attention because the situation required a clear head, and she'd learned that the best way to keep a clear head was to keep her hands in something exact. Gerald appeared in the kitchen doorway at 2 in the afternoon. She had known he would. "You want to tell me about the letter from the land office?" he said. "Not particularly," she said. The muscle in his jaw moved. "Eleanor, you've been here 3 years. 3 years I've kept a roof over your head and work on your table, and I've—" He stopped, restructured. "Whatever you think your grievance is." $37.24, she said. "That's my grievance. It has a number. You take me to a land office commissioner over $37. I'd take you over what's mine," she said. "The amount happens to be $37. Gerald looked at her with the expression of a man who'd been managing a situation he'd thought was fixed and was finding out it had been quietly developing in directions he hadn't authorized. And he didn't like the feeling and had no one to blame for it but himself, which made him like the feeling even less. "That trapper's put ideas in your head," he said. "I put ideas in my own head," she said. "He just treated me like someone whose head was worth talking to." The words came out cleaner than she'd expected, and she felt them land in the room between them with a finality that surprised even her. Gerald opened his mouth, closed it. "I'll have your wages by Friday," he said, and he left. Eleanor stood at her workbench and breathed slowly and waited for the adrenaline to finish moving through her before she picked up the bread knife, because she was particular about working with sharp things when her hands weren't entirely steady. She told Silas that evening when he came for supper. Not everything. She didn't recount the conversation word by word. She told him Gerald had agreed to pay what was owed, and that she'd been in correspondence with the Territorial Labor Office, and that she was nearly ready. Silas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You did all of that yourself." "I started it in February," she said. "I wasn't sure why I was doing it. I just felt like it was important to have things documented, to have a record. Because you were already thinking about leaving." She considered that. "I was thinking about being the kind of person who could leave. That's different." He looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as him absorbing something carefully rather than just hearing it. "There's a difference," he agreed. She'd made a simple meal that night, venison stew, nothing elaborate, because she'd been distracted all day, and simple food made with care beat complicated food made with half a mind. She sat across from him after he'd eaten, and they drank coffee and talked about practical things, what the supply situation looked like in the high country, what she'd need that he couldn't source from the mountain, what the journey up to the cabin involved in terms of time and terrain, and what she could reasonably carry. It was the most practical conversation she'd ever had about her own future, and the practicality of it, the fact that they were talking about cornmeal quantities and trail conditions rather than feelings and promises, made it feel more real and more trustworthy than anything romantic might have. She was not a woman who trusted the romantic. She'd been there. This was something else. Something that felt like two people with their eyes open trying to solve a problem together. She could work with that. Friday came. Gerald put an envelope on the kitchen workbench at 8 in the morning without a word. She picked it up and counted it when he was gone. $37.24, every cent. She put it in her apron pocket and went back to the biscuits. She'd given herself until Sunday. She spent Saturday quietly, which meant she cooked everything in the pantry that was worth cooking, used up the good flour, the last of the preserved herbs, made a proper batch of the cornbread with the mountain thyme that she'd been saving. She sent everything out to the dining room without comment, and the plates came back empty, and she noted that with a private satisfaction she didn't share with anyone. She wrote a last entry on the paper in the envelope. The date, the amount paid, the word received. She folded it closed and addressed it to August Pell at the Pryor Creek Land Office, and set it aside to give to Marta for posting, because she believed in having things on record even when the record was no longer necessary. She laid out her belongings on the cot that evening. It didn't take long. She had her carpet bag from Yankton patched twice at the handle. She had her clothes, functional, not many. She had the skillet she'd bought herself with her own money 2 years ago, the good one she kept clean separately, and she was taking it because it was hers and because it was the best skillet she'd ever worked with, and nobody was going to convince her to leave it behind. She had $53, now $90, and change with the back wages, in a folded cloth inside the bag. She had the dried mountain thyme in a small cloth pouch. She looked at the room, the hook on the wall, the cot with its thin mattress, the small window that faced the back of the building and in 3 years had given her exactly one view worth looking at, a brief 2-week stretch in early October when something low to the ground bloomed yellow and wild along the back fence before the frost took it. She did not feel sentimental. She felt, if she was honest, the particular sensation of a woman who had been holding her breath for a very long time and was noticing for the first time that she'd been doing it. Sunday morning she was up at 4 as always. She made the bread, because the bread mattered, and the people eating it deserved it even if they'd never once asked who made it. She made the biscuits. She prepped the breakfast through to the point where Sadie, who was learning, could manage the rest without her. She found Sadie before the first customers came in. "I'm leaving today," she said quietly. Sadie stared at her. "Today? Mr. Hatch? I'll tell him. I wanted to tell you first." She looked at the girl, who was 21 and nervous, and stuck in the same gravitational field Eleanor had just spent 4 months building a ladder out of. "The soup stock. Remember to watch it. He'll let it boil if you don't. And the bread?" "Eleanor." Sadie's voice had gone small. "Who's going to cook?" "Someone," Eleanor said. "He'll find someone." She paused. "Watch your wages. Don't let him get behind more than 2 weeks." Sadie's eyes were too bright, and Eleanor felt a pang for her that was real and complicated, the kind you feel for people you can't take with you. She found Gerald at the bar at 7:30. He looked at her and she could see him reading her face the same way she'd read his all these months. And she could see the moment he understood, because his expression went very still. "I'm leaving this morning," she said. "Eleanor, you have my work through breakfast. Sadie can manage the rest for today, and there's enough prepped that lunch won't be a problem if you keep it simple." She said it matter-of-factly, not to be cruel about it, but because the information was true and he needed it, and she was not going to pretend that the transition was his problem to be angry at her about. Gerald's face did several things quickly. She watched them pass. The calculation, the anger. The thing underneath the anger that she'd identified 2 weeks ago as something closer to fear. "You're making the worst mistake of your life," he said. "I've made mistakes before," she said. "This doesn't feel like one." "That trapper. You don't know him. You think you know him. Mr. Hatch," her voice was level. "You've given me your assessment. I've heard it. I don't need it again." He stared at her. And then, because Gerald Hatch was a man who understood ultimately when a thing was done, he turned back to his ledger. Eleanor went back to the kitchen. She served the last of the breakfast. She washed the pans she'd used, because she was not going to leave a dirty kitchen regardless of what else was happening. She took the folded envelope from her apron pocket and set it on the shelf above the stove where supplies were inventoried, Because it was documentation, and documentation belonged with the establishment records whether Gerald ever looked at it or not. She untied her apron. She had tied that apron every morning for 3 years. She knew its knot the way she knew her own heartbeat. Automatic, unremarkable, the gesture that meant the day was beginning. She untied it now slowly with full attention, the way she'd learned to give full attention to the things she did. She folded it, set it on the back of her chair, and looked at it for one moment. Then she picked up her carpet bag and her skillet, and she walked out of the kitchen. Silas was waiting at the front of the saloon. He'd come in quietly at 7, taken a corner table, ordered coffee, and waited. And when she came out of the kitchen with her bag, he stood up without any fanfare and picked up his own pack from beside the chair, and that was it. No speech, no moment engineered for effect, just a man who'd said he'd be there, being there. She was aware of eyes on her. Roy Decker was at the bar with his morning coffee, and he was staring. 2 of the other regulars were looking. Gerald had come out from behind the bar and was standing at the far end of the room with his arms crossed. Eleanor walked across the floor of the Red Coyote Saloon from the kitchen door to the front entrance, a distance of maybe 30 feet that she had crossed thousands of times, carrying plates and bowls and pots and coffee pots and baskets of bread. She crossed it this time with her bag in one hand and her skillet tucked under her arm and her chin level. Nobody said anything. She pushed open the front door and the spring morning came in cold and bright and smelling of mud and the creek and the pine on the edge of the territory, and she stepped through it. The door swung shut behind her. She stood on the step for just 1 second, feeling the air, feeling the weight of the bag, feeling the particular silence of a woman who has just closed something that needed closing. Then Silas came through the door behind her and stood beside her on the step, and she looked at him, and he looked at her. And neither of them said anything because there wasn't anything that needed saying. They walked toward the edge of Bitter Creek together, and the morning was cold and the road was still mostly mud, and nothing about any of it was easy or clean or perfect. It was just hers. For the first time in a very long time, all of it was hers. The road out of Bitter Creek was not a road so much as a suggestion. 2 ruts worn into the mud by wagon wheels that had passed often enough to create the impression of intention without ever quite committing to a direction. Eleanor had walked it before, on her Tuesday morning trips to Marta's dry goods store, but she'd never walked it with a bag in her hand and no plan to come back, and the familiar ground felt strange under her boots, in the way that familiar things sometimes do when the context around them changes completely. Silas set a pace that was steady without being punishing, which she noted and appreciated without saying so. He knew this terrain and she didn't, and he could have walked faster. She could see that in the way he moved, the efficiency of it. A man who'd covered a great deal of ground over a great many years. But he matched her without making a point of matching her, which was its own form of respect. They didn't talk much for the first hour. The morning was cold still, the kind of cold that April kept in reserve for the early hours before the sun got high enough to mean anything. Eleanor pulled her coat tighter and watched the landscape open up around her as Bitter Creek fell behind. The scrubby trees along the creek bank giving way to open grassland still winter brown, and beyond that the first suggestion of elevation, the ground beginning its long conversation with the mountains that would eventually become an argument and then a commitment. She hadn't looked back at the saloon when they left. She thought about that as she walked. She'd expected to feel the pull of it, not fondness, but the gravitational drag of the familiar, the way even a bad place can develop a hold on you just through the accumulation of days. But there had been nothing. She'd stepped through the door, and the pull had simply been absent, and what she'd felt instead was the particular lightness of something set down. 3 years was a long time to carry something without realizing the weight of it. "How long to the cabin?" she asked, when they'd cleared the tree line and the ground was starting to rise. 2 days, Silas said. "There's a trapper's shelter about halfway that's solid. We can stop there for the night." She'd known it would be more than a day's walk. She'd packed accordingly. But hearing it confirmed made the scale of the thing real in a way that thinking about it hadn't quite managed. 2 days' walk into the mountains, no road, no town within reasonable distance. A cabin she'd never seen, built by a man she'd spent a total of perhaps 14 hours with across 5 months. She kept walking. The trapper's shelter was a low structure built into the side of a granite outcropping. 3 walls of cut timber and 1 wall of stone, with a door that didn't hang quite straight and a roof that had been patched in 2 places with what looked like flattened tin cans. There was a fire ring inside and a stack of split wood against the stone wall and a wooden shelf with a few supplies left by previous travelers in the understood courtesy of the mountain, where you took what you needed and replaced what you could. Eleanor looked at the shelf when they arrived. Salt, a tin of lard, some dried jerky of uncertain origin, 3 potatoes that were still firm. "Are these meant to be used?" she asked. "That's what they're there for," Silas said, feeding the fire. She looked at what she'd brought in her own pack: the dried mountain thyme, some cornmeal, a folded cloth with salt and a small amount of sugar, 2 dried apples she'd taken from the kitchen stores on Saturday without guilt because she had worked 3 years for every apple in that pantry. She looked at the fire ring and the iron grate laid across it, well used and solid. "Give me an hour," she said. He looked at her. "We don't need anything elaborate." "I know we don't need it," she said. "I want to." He went quiet, which she was beginning to understand was his version of stepping aside gracefully. She made a simple thing with what was available. The potatoes cut and fried in the lard with the salt and a pinch of the mountain thyme. The cornmeal made into a rough flatbread cooked directly on the grate. The dried apples reconstituted in a little water and softened over the fire with the last of her sugar. It was not the red coyote. It was not her cast iron skillets or her organized pantry or any of the equipment she'd spent 3 years learning to coax into producing something worth eating. It was a fire ring and a tin grate and a handful of ingredients, and she stood over it in the low doorway of a shelter on the side of a mountain and paid it full attention, the way she paid everything full attention. And when it was done, she handed Silas his portion without apology. He ate it. Then he looked at the fire for a while and said, "You made good food on a bad setup." "It's not that good," she said, with the specific honesty she'd been practicing. "The flatbread's too thick in the middle. I don't know this fire yet." "You'll learn it." "I'll learn the cabin fire," she said. "This one I'll probably never use again." He looked at her with something in his expression that was almost amused. "You're already thinking about the cabin fire." "I'm always thinking about the fire," she said. "The fire is the beginning of everything." They sat in the shelter that night with the door propped half open so the smoke could find its way out. And outside, the mountain was dark in a way that Eleanor had not experienced before. Not the dark of a prairie night with its flat horizon, but the dark of elevation and trees and the sense of something large and indifferent pressing close on all sides. She was not frightened exactly, but she was alert in a way that felt new, like a faculty being asked to wake up after a long time of not being needed. "Are there things I need to know?" she asked. "About living up there. Things I wouldn't know to ask about." Silas thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. "The first winter is the hardest," he said. "Not because it's the worst winter necessarily, but because you don't know the rhythms yet. You don't know when things freeze and when they don't, where the wind comes from, how the cabin breathes in the cold. You make decisions that seem reasonable, and they turn out to be wrong, and you have to fix them." He paused. "I made a lot of wrong decisions my first winter." "What was the worst one?" He considered. "I didn't bank the fire correctly the first week of December. Woke up to a dead fire and 10 degrees inside the cabin. Took me 2 hours with numb hands to get it going again." "I know how to bank a fire," Eleanor said. "I figured you might." He looked at the current fire. "What else do you want to know?" "What do you do up there when you're not trapping?" "Fix things. The cabin always needs something. I read when I have light for it." He paused. "I think. More than is probably useful." "What do you think about?" "A lot of things. What's worth doing, what I've done badly and why. Whether there are better ways to build something than the ways I know." He looked at her. "Lately I've been thinking about cornbread." She almost laughed. It wasn't quite a laugh, but it was close, and she could feel that it was close, which was its own thing. The nearness of something she hadn't felt the nearness of in a long time. "Go to sleep," she said. "We've got a full day tomorrow." Well, the cabin was exactly what he'd described, and also nothing like she'd imagined, which was always how places were when you finally saw them after building them in your head. It sat in a clearing on the eastern face of the mountain, surrounded by pine on 3 sides, and open to the south where the slope fell away, and the view was the kind that made you stop walking and just stand there with it for a moment, because it was the kind of view that demanded acknowledgement. She had not expected the view. He hadn't mentioned it. She would find out later that he'd chosen the location partly for the light, partly for the wind shelter, and partly because of the view, and that he'd never mentioned the last reason because he wasn't entirely sure how to say, "I built this where I did because I wanted to look at something beautiful every day without it sounding like something it wasn't." The cabin was solid, small, 2 rooms as stated, with a main room that held the hearth, a work table, a chair he'd made himself that was clearly the work of someone who was a good builder but not an experienced furniture maker, and shelves along one wall that were very well constructed indeed. The second room had the cot and another shelf and the window he'd set on the south-facing wall, and when she stood in it for the first time and looked out through the glass, real glass, carried up in pieces over 3 trips, she understood why he'd second-guessed this room for longer than the floor. He'd been imagining someone standing here. She didn't say that out loud. "The hearth draws well," he said from the doorway. He was watching her look at the room with the expression of a man who'd spent a long time building something for an occasion and was now finding the occasion almost harder to manage than the building. "Yes," she said, "I can see that. The work table in the main room, I built it at my height. I don't know if that's—" "I'll manage," she said. Then, because she could see it actually concerned him, "If it's a problem after a few weeks, I'll tell you." He nodded. She put her bag on the shelf in the second room and her skillet on the work table in the main room and looked at the hearth and the fire ring and the iron hook for hanging pots and the limited but thoughtful inventory of what he had on the supply shelves, and she felt something she hadn't felt since she was very young, the specific sensation of a kitchen that was entirely hers to learn. She started a fire, not for any particular cooking purpose, just to know the hearth. The first month was hard. She had known it would be hard, and knowing it didn't make it easier, which was one of the reliable injustices of difficult things. The altitude changed how things cooked. Water boiled at a lower temperature, which altered bread and stock in ways that took her 3 weeks to recalibrate around. The flour Silas had stored was a different grade than what she'd been using at the Red Coyote, and behaved differently in everything she made. Her first loaf of bread came out dense in a way that embarrassed her privately, and that Silas ate without comment, which she appreciated but didn't completely assuage. "It's not right," she said, the morning of the dense loaf, looking at it on the table. "It's edible," he said. "Edible isn't my standard. It's bread at 7,000 feet made with flour that's been stored through a Dakota winter. I've had worse by a significant margin." "That's a low bar," she said. "Agreed. Set a higher one." He poured his coffee. "You will." She was adjusting to the rhythms of the mountain in other ways too, ones she hadn't anticipated. She was sleeping differently, deeper, without the light alertness she'd maintained in the storage closet where she'd always been half-conscious of the sounds from the saloon. She was eating at different times. She was working in a different relationship with daylight because the mountain changed the light schedule, and she found herself organizing her day around the hearth and the sun rather than around Gerald Hatch's meal service times. It was disorienting, and then, gradually, it wasn't. She and Silas were learning to share a small space, which was its own negotiation conducted mostly without explicit discussion. She learned that he needed quiet in the early morning, genuinely needed it, that talking before he'd had his coffee and an hour of sitting with the day was asking something he didn't have to give yet. He learned that she reorganized spaces as a way of thinking, that things would move around on the shelves for the first few weeks, not from randomness, but from her working out the most logical arrangement, and that the arrangement once settled would be extremely logical and also unmovable. "Why did the salt move, What?" he asked one morning in the tone of a man conducting a genuine inquiry rather than a complaint. "It was too far from the fire," she said. "When you're cooking, the salt needs to be within reach of your right hand at the stove. Where you had it, I had to cross 2 steps every time." He looked at where it was now, looked at where it had been. "That makes sense," he said, and went back to his coffee. She had expected friction. She had expected the adjustment of 2 adults who'd each been largely alone renegotiating space and habit, and friction was part of that. What she hadn't expected was how reasonable it was, like Not that they agreed on everything, but that disagreement between them had a quality of actual problem solving rather than the kind of territorial claiming she'd experienced before. When they hit something that needed sorting out, they sorted it out, usually in plain language and without residue. She kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. She caught herself waiting for it, actively, in quiet moments. The habit of a woman who'd learned that goodness had a catch, and that the catch usually came when you'd relaxed. 6 weeks in, she said it directly. They were sitting on the south-facing side of the cabin in the May evening, the view doing what it did, and she said, "I keep expecting something to be wrong with this." Silas looked at her. He wasn't surprised by the statement. She'd noticed he was rarely surprised by her, which was one of the things she was still getting used to. "Wrong how?" he asked. "Wrong in the way things usually are," she said. "The version of this I don't know about yet. The thing you turn out to be, or the thing I turn out to be, that makes it not work." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the view. "There's probably something," he said. "I can think of several things about myself that are genuinely difficult to live with." "Like what?" "I go quiet for days sometimes," he said. "Not at anyone, just I stop talking. It's not about something being wrong, it's just how I get. Some people find it—" He paused. "Absent." She thought about that. "I'll tell you if it becomes a problem. And I can think of things about you," he said carefully. "Go ahead." "You punish yourself for imperfect cooking when the only person who'd graded a failure is you. It puts a particular tension in the room that's hard to work around." She opened her mouth, closed it. The accuracy of it was uncomfortable in the specific way accurate things are. "I'm aware of that," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not telling you to fix it. I'm just saying it's there." They sat with the imperfect inventory of each other for a while, in the evening light, and it wasn't comfortable in the tidy way she'd feared happiness might be, some clean, resolved thing that didn't quite feel real. It was uncomfortable in all the specific human ways, and it was also, undeniably, real. That was new. That was worth something. The travelers started coming in July. She hadn't planned for it. Silas hadn't either exactly, though he'd known there was traffic on the northern pass in summer, hunters and prospectors, and the occasional party heading further west who needed a waypoint. He'd been a waypoint himself before, sharing coffee and basic information about the trail ahead and sending people on their way. What he hadn't had before was Eleanor. The first party was 3 men heading north who smelled the hearth fire from a quarter-mile away and followed it with the specific directional instinct of hungry people near food. Eleanor had a pot of venison and dried bean stew going that she'd made for their own dinner, and she saw them come into the clearing and made a rapid calculation of what she had and what it would take to feed 5 instead of 2. "There's enough," she said to Silas before he'd even asked the question. She stretched the stew with additional broth and brought up the last of a cornbread batch that was cooling on the shelf, and the 3 men ate at the table Silas had built, which was big enough for 4 she'd noticed when she first looked at it, and had wondered about. And they ate with the particular silence of men who'd been eating trail food for 2 weeks, and had suddenly been given something that tasted like it had been made by someone who cared about the outcome. One of them, an older man with a gray beard and weathered hands, looked up from his bowl and said, "Ma'am, I don't know what you put in this, but I'd pay double whatever you're charging." Eleanor looked at him. "I'm not charging," she said. "Then I'll leave something for the supplies," he said, and he did. A $1 coin, set on the table when he got up, without making a moment of it. She picked it up after they'd gone, looked at it, put it in the tin she'd started using for such things, without having consciously decided to start a tin for such things. The word traveled the way words travel on a trail system, slowly and surely, passed from one traveler to the next like weather information or warnings about the road. By August, they were seeing a dozen travelers a week passing through the clearing, and maybe half of them stayed for a meal, and Eleanor was managing the supplies with the same precision she'd applied to the Red Coyote pantry, but with the additional variable that resupply required a 2-day trip down to the settlement at the base of the pass, and she had to plan 2 to 3 weeks ahead at all times. She was better at planning ahead than she'd have expected herself to be. Silas went down for supplies twice a month and came back with what she'd written on the list, and occasionally things she hadn't written that he'd thought of, which was one of the more reliable small pleasures of the arrangement. He came back once with a bundle of dried herbs from a trader passing through the settlement, varieties she'd never worked with, labeled in a handwriting she couldn't read, origin unknown. She spent a week experimenting with them the way she'd spent that early morning in her kitchen at the Red Coyote, and 2 of them became permanent parts of her working pantry, and one turned out to be useful for absolutely nothing she was making, and she told him so, and he took it with the equanimity she'd come to expect. "What about this one?" he asked, holding up the 4th bundle. She smelled it. "I don't know yet. Give me more time." "You've had a week." "Some things take longer than a week." "Fair enough," he said, and put it back on the shelf. "Boy?" "B." In September, Winona came. Eleanor had written to her in June, a proper letter carried down to the settlement by a passing hunter who'd promised to post it, and she'd written back in July with the efficient brevity that was Winona's natural register. "Glad you're there. Thomas has an interest in trapping. Bring it up with your man." She'd brought it up with her man, who had said he'd think about it, and had then spent 2 weeks quietly not mentioning it, and then one morning at breakfast had said that if Winona's nephew wanted to learn trapping, the fall season was the time to learn it. Winona arrived on a Tuesday in September with Thomas and a horse that looked like it had opinions about mountain trails and was not keeping them to itself. Thomas was 12 now and had grown 4 inches and still communicated primarily through deliberate action and minimal speech, which made him comfortable to have in a small space. Winona looked at the cabin with the systematic attention she gave everything, walked through both rooms, stood at the south-facing window in Eleanor's room for a moment, and came back out and said, "Good light." "The whole reason for the window," Eleanor said. Winona looked at her. Really looked at her, the way you look at someone when you're taking a genuine accounting of how they are. "You look different," she said. "I'm outside more." "That's not what I mean." Eleanor considered. "I know," she said. They sat at the table that evening, all 4 of them, which was tight, which was fine, and Eleanor served the venison roast she'd been working since morning with the mountain herbs, and the good sage and the last of a batch of onions, and cornbread with the mountain thyme, the recipe she'd developed over months of altitude adjustment until it was finally what she'd been trying to make since that early morning with Silas in her kitchen at the Red Coyote. Thomas ate 2 pieces without speaking, and then looked at the cornbread with the expression of someone conducting internal analysis and said, "What makes it that color?" "The thyme," Eleanor said, "and I let the butter brown a little in the pan before the batter goes in." He nodded, filed it. Silas took Thomas out the next morning to look at the trap lines, and Winona and Eleanor were alone for the first time since April, sitting at the table with coffee, and the mountain was doing its September thing outside, where the light came in low and golden and the trees at the edge of the clearing were starting to turn at the tips. "Gerald hired someone new," Winona said. "A man from Kansas. He's not as good." "I didn't think he would be," Eleanor said, without satisfaction. "Just fact." The regulars noticed. Roy Decker said something to Marta about it. "Roy Decker can make the ride up here if he wants decent food," Eleanor said, and then paused and amended. "That was unkind. I don't actually mean that." "A little unkind," Winona agreed. "Also a little deserved." Eleanor wrapped her hands around her cup. "How is Marta?" "Good. She raised her flour prices, which I think was partly your leaving. Gerald was her best customer." "He underpaid her for years," Eleanor said. "She knows. She's making up for it now." Winona looked at her. "You're not sorry you left?" "No." "Not for a moment of it?" Eleanor thought about this honestly, the way Winona's directness always seemed to invite. She thought about the dense bread in the first weeks and the learning curve of the altitude and the 4 days in June when Silas had gone quiet, and she hadn't known what to do with the quiet, and had cooked 4 increasingly elaborate things just to have something to concentrate on. She thought about the mornings when she still woke at 4 out of habit and lay in the dark in the second room and felt the specific texture of a life that was unrecognizable from the one she'd had a year before. "There are moments," she said carefully, "when it's harder than I expected. Not moments of regret exactly. More like moments when I realize how much I'd accepted as normal That wasn't. Winona nodded. But no, Eleanor said. I'm not sorry. Winona picked up her coffee. Good, she said. The first hard winter proved Silas right in that it was the hardest. November brought a cold that Eleanor had no previous reference for. Not the Dakota flat country cold, which was wind and exposure, but the mountain cold, which was a different animal, heavier and more personal. The kind that came through the walls in a specific direction and required specific countering. She learned the cabin's weak points the hard way. The gap under the front door that needed a second draft cloth in December. The north-facing window frame that transferred cold straight into the room so that she learned to hang a second layer of oilcloth over it in the serious months. The way the smoke from the hearth backed up on particular wind directions and required adjusting the damper in a combination that took her most of November to work out. She and Silas spent a week in October laying in wood, which was more physical work than she'd done in a sustained way in years, and she was sore in muscles she hadn't known she was still operating. She didn't complain. She also didn't pretend she wasn't sore, which was different from not complaining, and Silas came in one evening to find her sitting at the table pressing both hands flat on the warm surface near the fire, and he went and got the small jar of rendered bear fat he kept for leather maintenance and put it on the table beside her without a word. That's for leather, she said. Works on hands, too, he said. Old Trapper showed me. She used it. It helped. There were evenings in December when the cold pressed so hard against the cabin walls that she could hear it, an almost physical sound, and she sat close to the hearth and thought about the storage closet with the hook on the wall and tried to determine honestly if she missed anything about it. She missed Winona. She wrote letters and got letters back, which was something. She didn't miss the saloon. She didn't miss the visibility, or the invisibility, or Gerald Hatch's voice, or the way a room full of 30 people could feel like a specific kind of solitude that was lonelier than actual solitude. She missed sometimes the abundance of a well-stocked kitchen, because the mountain in winter required a discipline of scarcity she was still learning to be creative within. But that was problem-solving, not loss. She was good at problem-solving. She was learning what she was good at, up here, in ways she hadn't had space to learn before. She was good at adaptation, which she'd always known but now had daily evidence of. She was good at patience, which surprised her somewhat. She was less good at asking for help, which Silas pointed out once specifically when she'd spent 2 hours trying to rehang the front door by herself rather than wait 30 minutes for him to get back from the trapline. I had it handled, she said. The door's still crooked, he said. It's less crooked than it was. He looked at it. That's true, he said. But you could have waited. Waiting feels like depending, she said, before she'd fully decided to say it. He looked at her, not with the expression of a man who'd caught something, but with the expression of a man who understood what she'd just said and took it seriously. Depending and cooperating aren't the same thing, he said. She stood with that for a while. Then she said, Help me with the door. Together it took 12 minutes. The door hung straight. She made a note of the difference between needing help and being diminished by it, which turned out to be a note she could have used about 15 years earlier, and filed it in the place where she kept things she intended to actually carry with her. By the second spring, people came to the cabin specifically. Not many. The mountain kept that from becoming a problem, because reaching them required intention and effort, and most casual travelers didn't make the climb. But hunters and trappers and a few families moving west had begun passing the word in the settlements below that there was a woman on the east face of the North Pass who could do things with a fire and a handful of supplies that would rearrange your understanding of what a meal could be in the territory. A party of 4 arrived in April with a letter of introduction from a settler family 3 ranges to the east who had stopped at the cabin in the fall and eaten Eleanor's roasted grouse with the high country sage. The letter was addressed to the cook on the North Pass and thanked her and asked if she'd be willing to show the sender's daughter-in-law some of the technique for the mountain bread. She read the letter twice. She handed it to Silas. He read it. You're getting correspondence, he said. I'm getting addressed to the cook on the North Pass, she said. That's you. I know it's me. She put the letter on the table. Nobody's ever written to me about cooking before. He picked his coffee up and looked at her over it with the expression she'd come to think of as his considering face, the one he wore when he was deciding whether to say the thing that was occurring to him. "You know," he said, "you've never once referred to yourself as a good cook." "I know what I'm capable of." "That's not what I said." She looked at him. "You've said things like, 'I know this fire,' or 'the bread needed more time,'" he said. "You talk about cooking like it's a set of technical problems you're solving. You've never once said, 'I'm good at this.'" She looked at the letter on the table. She thought about a storage closet and a hook on a wall and 32 cents a day and 3 years of empty plates coming back through the kitchen window without a word attached. She thought about the night of the storm and the moment in her kitchen when she'd called her own cornbread nothing special and meant it, had genuinely believed it, had been saying it for long enough that it had become a fact she lived inside without questioning. "I'm good at this," she said. The words came out quieter than she'd intended. Not because she was uncertain. She said them and felt them as true in the uncomplicated way that actually true things feel. But because it turned out that saying a thing you'd been keeping from yourself for a very long time required a moment of actual consideration, even when the thing was obviously correct. Silas said nothing. He didn't agree or confirm or make a moment of it. He just picked up his coffee and went back to what he was doing, because the thing she'd said was plainly true and didn't need embellishing. She picked up the letter from the party of 4. She'd feed them. She'd show the daughter-in-law the bread. She had things to teach. Eleanor Briggs did not become a legend in the way stories sometimes claim. All at once. Recognized. Celebrated. She became known the way most things worth knowing about actually become known. Slowly, specifically, by the people who'd experienced the thing directly and couldn't stop mentioning it to others who hadn't. The cook on the North Pass. The woman in the cabin on the east face with the cornbread made with mountain thyme. She was 41 when a journalist from a territorial paper came through on his way further west and stopped at the cabin and wrote about the meal he had there in a piece about life in the high country. He described the food in 3 sentences and her in 1, and the one sentence was factual. A cook of considerable skill who settled the North Pass with her husband 7 years ago. And she read it and felt nothing in particular about the description except a mild acknowledgement that considerable skill was accurate and that her husband was a reasonable way to describe Silas, though they'd formalized nothing and both of them found the formality of the concept mildly unnecessary given the practical reality. She showed Silas the article. "Considerable skill," he read. "It's accurate," she said. "It undersells it." "Most things do," she said. "That's not a problem with the things." He looked at her over the article. "When did you get philosophical?" 7 years ago, approximately, she said, give or take a blizzard. He smiled then, the full version of the smile she'd seen rarely enough in 7 years that it still registered, still landed somewhere. He had a good smile. She'd thought so that first night in her kitchen when she'd been looking for the catch in what he was saying and found nothing but a man who meant what he said, and she thought so now. She took the article and put it in the tin where she kept the letters. There were many letters in the tin now. From Winona, who had eventually moved to a town 2 ranges south that had a school for Thomas, who was studying to be a land surveyor. From Marta, who still saved back the good flour out of habit, even though Eleanor wasn't there to buy it. From the daughter-in-law, who'd come for the bread lesson and gone home and apparently not stopped cooking since, because she wrote twice a year to report on her experiments. One letter in the tin was from August Pell at the Pryor Creek Land Office, acknowledging receipt of her final documentation and noting that the matter had been resolved in her favor and the record kept on file. She'd read that letter several times in the first year. She didn't need to read it anymore. But she kept it because some things should stay documented, and because the woman who had spent 3 years being invisible deserved to have proof that she'd stood up and been counted when it mattered. The tin lived on the shelf in the second room, beside the south-facing window, in the good light. The mountain thyme grew in the small plot she'd cultivated on the south side of the cabin, started from Silas's original bundle, and expanded over the years until she had more than she needed, which meant she could share it, which she did, with travelers, with the daughter-in-law, with a Lakota family who settled 2 miles down the slope and whose daughter came up in the summers to help and learn and go home each fall knowing more than she'd arrived with. The cornbread made with mountain thyme became the thing people mentioned. She never thought of it as the thing she was known for. She thought of it as a recipe she'd developed in collaboration with a man who'd carried herbs down from a high slope because he'd been thinking about a woman in a kitchen and wanted to bring her something worth thinking about. The recipe was hers. The mountain thyme was his. The result was theirs together, which was, she'd found, the way the best things generally worked. On an October evening in the 7th year, she sat on the south-facing side of the cabin in the late light that she never got tired of. That particular gold that the mountain made in fall, different from any light she'd seen in a flat country sky. And she thought about the woman she'd been in the storage closet with the hook on the wall. The woman who'd cooked perfectly and been invisible and had believed, in the place where beliefs lived before you examined them, that she deserved what she'd been given. She didn't think about her with pity. She thought about her with something closer to recognition and something closer still to respect. That woman had gotten up at 4 a.m. every day and cooked excellent food and held her standards when everything around her was trying to lower them. And she had done all of that in a situation that offered her nothing but continuance in return. And she had kept the one thing no one could take from her, which was the quality of what she made. That woman had been worth more than 32 cents a day. She'd always been worth more. She just hadn't had anyone near her who was interested in the arithmetic. Now she did. Silas came out and sat beside her with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. And the view did what it did, and the light was going the way it went in October, and the cabin behind them smelled of the venison she'd put on earlier, and the wood smoke, and faintly, permanently, of mountain thyme. She wrapped both hands around the cup. She was not a woman who had gotten everything right. She had made mistakes, and she would make more. She had been afraid when she should have moved sooner and moved when she still had reasons to be afraid. And some days she still woke at 4 out of old habit and lay in the dark for a while, not knowing entirely what to do with the person she'd become. But the person she'd become was hers. That was the whole of it, really. The thing she'd spent so long without and had found in the least likely sequence of events. A blizzard, a stranger, a kitchen. The unremarkable act of one person treating another person as though they were worth talking to. She drank her coffee. The mountain held its ground around them, indifferent and enormous and somehow, after all this time, familiar. She was home.